I want to present three Christians who I respect and whose lives I wish to celebrate. Since I'm an atheist and an anti-theist, this demands some sort of explanation. I had planned to briefly offer this explanation here, but it turned out to be complex enough to warrant its own video, so if you have the time and the interest, I encourage you to watch that video before this one. Before I introduce these people, I want to make it clear that my respect for them doesn't entail a 100% endorsement of everything they ever said or did. I also want to avoid the impression that they were paragons of virtue without any grounds for criticism. However, I think that any valid criticism of these people stems from their humanity rather than their theism. There are no perfect heroes, theist or otherwise. I acknowledge their failings and celebrate their victories. Also, I don't want to suggest that these are the only theists worthy of respect. These are just the ones that first spring to my mind when I ask myself whether I admire any Christians. These are in no particular order. Albert Schweitzer's life and his work cannot be easily summarized. He was a Lutheran most famous for his medical missionary work in La Bahreine, Gabon, in Central Africa. It must be acknowledged at the outset that he has rightfully been criticized for his unconscious racism and condescending paternalism towards those he served. Nevertheless, he devoted the majority of his life to repairing some of the damage done by white colonialism at great personal cost to himself and largely out of step with his European contemporaries. Instead of preaching his religious beliefs, he expressed his spirituality through healing. But I admire him most for his ethic of Ehrfurcht vor dem Leben, or reverence for life. This was no simplistic platitude, but a sophisticated development of earlier moral philosophies. It takes a lot of time to fully appreciate the depth of this ethic, but it can be summarized in only 4 words. Do no harm unnecessarily. This ethic acknowledges that all life requires some harm to other life, but in recognition of our mutual striving, why should we do any more harm than we have to? Our own will to live shares a unity with the will to live of an elephant or a blade of grass and connects us. Schweitzer made it clear that there aren't any set rules for each situation, there are no dictates to follow. Each person must decide for themselves which harms are necessary. In the philosophy of civilization, Schweitzer said, I can do no other than hold on to the fact that the will to live appears in me as will to live which aims at becoming one with other will to live. This fact is the light which shines for me in the darkness. Although Schweitzer couched his ethic in theistic terms, the fundamental principles that he proposed do not require a belief in God, only a recognition that every life strives to exist. One of my favorite Christians is a man who is a personal friend of mine who deserves his privacy, so I'll refer to him as Terence, which is not his real name. Terence never won any awards or achieved any degree of fame, but he won my respect. He and I are no longer in contact, partly because I moved away from his country and international friendships can be hard to maintain, and partly because his wife was a raging homophobe who didn't appreciate my friendship with him. However, I remember him fondly, and to this day think of his example as a litmus test by which I can judge the integrity of other Christians. Terence was a barber and a hairstylist who ran his own shop. Many of his friends were gay, and despite the fact that he was heterosexual, he wasn't bothered when people assumed he was gay too. He was also friends with a lot of women and was a compassionate ally to their struggles. Terence smoked pot and kept company with addicts of far more dangerous substances, tolerating their failures with incredible patience, even when it harmed him personally. He was generous to a fault, sometimes to such an extreme that I worried he was allowing people to take advantage of him. But he didn't mind the sting of betrayal so much as the prospect of being a person who didn't extend kindness to others. I knew Terence for a long time before I found out that he was a Christian. In fact, he never told me himself. A completely random meeting of a mutual acquaintance revealed it. I was talking to a woman I had just met, and she mentioned something about Pastor Terence, along with other details that suggested she was talking about my friend. I asked her some questions and discovered that she was talking about my Terence. I was shocked. Not only was my friend a Christian, he was a preacher. I was floored. He had never once mentioned religion to me in any context. I asked him about it later, and he shyly admitted that yes, he was a preacher. I asked him why he had never told me this, since it was obviously an important part of his life. I will never forget his reply. I think that real Christians bring people to God through their example. Telling you about my beliefs will never win your heart, but I hope my actions will. Terence didn't convert me, but his lessons stayed with me. Lead by example and care about people. For those who aren't familiar with Fred Rogers, he is most famous for a television show called Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. As a child of the late 70s and early 80s, I grew up with Mr. Rogers. I didn't watch a lot of TV growing up, probably less than was typical for the time, but there was something about Mr. Rogers that caught my attention in a way that most television personalities didn't. Fred Rogers was a unique personality in television, particularly as it became more and more commercialized. He didn't view children as consumers to exploit, and was appalled by the careless bombardment that characterized most children's entertainment programming. He wanted to use the tool of television to nurture children, to encourage them to learn and think and experience. He once said that the most important goal of each show was to strengthen a child's self-esteem and to emphasize our common humanity. Mr. Rogers was ordained as a Presbyterian minister in 1963, but to any child watching the show, he was simply a friendly man who gave his time and attention to ask, to tell, and to show things about the world in which we live. To my knowledge, he never mentioned his God or his religion on air. He let his consideration for other human beings and his interest in the world to speak for him. He didn't shy away from difficult topics. He talked with children honestly and compassionately about topics ranging from whistles to warfare. He nurtured minds and imaginative capacity while making clear the distinction between fantasy and reality. He taught by example how to be compassionate, patient, thoughtful, and loving. He encouraged curiosity and creativity. He was a theist all of his life, but he offered all that he could to children and adults without proselytizing, without condition. He lived by his example, and his example was exemplary. When I look for the common denominator between the Christians that I admire, it isn't hard to find. All of these people chose to express their spirituality through their actions, rather than through a frantic attempt to convert people. None of them went around quoting scripture. All of them served as living examples of their beliefs. And more to the point, all of them were brave enough to notice that their holy book wasn't that holy, and adopted beliefs and practices that surpassed the Bible's teachings in maturity and compassion. This does mean that they cherry-picked the Bible, but I can't help noticing that what they picked placed them firmly on the side of secular humanist values. If all religious belief took this form, you wouldn't hear a peep out of me. I still wouldn't consider a belief in God to be rational, but irrationality that manifests itself as compassion rather than control is a rationality I can live with. I would prefer to see theism evaporate eventually as humanity grows, but since theism will be with us for a long time to come, I'd like to see atheists leave a little room at the intellectual table for theists like these. Their rarity is all the more reason to acknowledge them and accord them some respect in our discourses. And to any religious believers who may have gotten lost and stumbled onto my channel, I hope the theist I presented here will inspire you. There are many ways for your beliefs to manifest themselves in the world. Some are worthy even of my respect, and some are not.